Greetings, filmmakers and film buffs. My name is Jonathan Leiter. I also go by Filmmaker J, and you are listening to the very first episode of Shootin the Shot, brought to you by way of the Cinema Warehouse. This being the first episode of the Shootin the Shot podcast, I'll give you a quick rundown. Unlike many other film-related podcasts and discussion shows, this series will not be focused on reviews. Instead, my aim is to make this podcast a platform for discussing the various production and narrative elements that make or break a film. And each episode will either take a deep dive, and the trails that follow, into a general topic area like character development, shot composition, or the editing of trailers, or my co-host and I will conduct a thought experiment. These thought experiments will usually take the form of each host being tasked with designing a hypothetical film, but within a few previously chosen guidelines. For example, what if you had to make the 2008 Iron Man film in 1940? Could you do it with decade-specific special effects, and could you make it work? Could you make it a good movie? Maybe even just as good as the real Iron Man movie was. I've already set aside over a dozen ideas just like that for future episodes. For today's outing, we're going to be venturing into the pertinent and pivotal topic of opening sequences, or how can you effectively engage an audience in the first few minutes. Joining me today is my good friend Christopher Horton, a man after my own heart. Has a bachelor's degree in creative writing, he has been gifted with a lexicon-like brain and a passion for history, and as you'll soon see, he is the ideal person to talk to when you want to discuss anything involving scripting, plot, or character development. So, let's get our focus and roll episode 1.
Sound check. I can watch things move on the screen. Woo!
So these I'm going to have to boost by 10 at least.
Right.
But, about an inch away
Right.
is best for most of it.
That, and you're going to have to edit, all of this out. I mean, you could leave it in if you want. That's up to you.
Yeah.
But, more than likely, people don't want us to talk about the factor of 10. We're not mathematicians or engineers or people who get paid absurd amounts of money for anything. But hey, one day, that's the goal. But so we were discussing the idea of kind of how you open a story, how you open those original things, and I was telling you that my first thoughts, particularly since my experience is kind of more in this format, is to go to television and talk about that for a second. The cold open for Breaking Bad, which is it's almost a cliche to even mention it, considering it's so well established at this point, and it's such a wonderful, everyone will go back and be like, this is how you do a cold open, children. Look, this is that wonderful, glorious place where all the cold opens just bound through the fields and everyone gives you Emmys. But to establish that, it has everything really working for it. It is almost, it might be the perfect. It is very close to the idealized kind of perfect open, and I would even extend that to saying it's probably one of the best opening scenes for any kind of a story I've ever seen. Because essentially you have the character of Walter White doing something absurd, but very intense. You have him doing something that catches our attention because we have no idea what it is or the purpose of it, but we know the stakes are high. We have no idea why they're high. We have no idea what's going on, but we're invested because we know something bad is happening or going to happen or just happened because he doesn't have pants on.
Yes.
And that's basically all we need to know. So we're kind of already tied into that moment. And then when he gets out of the van and he pulls out the mic, and I think the first time we actually hear him speak is when he's talking to the camera and he's addressing his family.
Mm-hmm.
We know everything we ever need to know about Walter White in those first few seconds of that conversation.
Yes.
Because he's like, I didn't do anything bad. I'm just a good person. Whatever they tell you is a lie. So forth and so forth. And then we watch him pull out a gun and wait for the cops to show up. We know from that moment that he is overly conscious of what his family thinks about him, about what he thinks about himself, about what society thinks about him, but at the end of the day, he's going to do what he wants to do, and he's going to pull out a gun and use violence and use threat and use his ability to take what he wants rather than any of the systems in place in society to actually give him that. And so, like, there's really no better way to set up like that character and that story, because that is what we spend the rest of our time with in that entire show, is watching Walter White do that again and again and again and again. What's another good show that does something like that?
Well, that you were mentioning that that's like the pinnacle of a cold open. Is that because it's the kind where you show like just before the climax at the head of the episode? Because that's what it's doing. It's showing you just minutes before the climax ahead of time and then replaying it later in sequence.
You mean like taking it out of order?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to say that's not entirely it. Granted, I'm more of a structuralist when it comes to storytelling, like the idea of like things that loop back to each other or things that like are clearly foreshadowing of other things. I just love to death. Reservoir Dogs does this. In the opening scene of Reservoir Dogs, when they're all there before the job and they're all buying breakfast or whatever meal they're buying, one guy doesn't tip. And they make a big point about it. Everyone goes, wait, who didn't tip the waitress? There are only 10 tips here. Who didn't tip the waitress? Or there are only so many tips on the table. Who didn't tip the waitress? That scene is the entire film. Everyone trying to find out the one guy that has a different moral code than everyone else. The rest of the film is them just doing that with guns.
Right.
That's it. Like, that moment at the table is the movie. And so I don't think that the reason that is the pinnacle of cold opens, the particular Breaking Bad cold open is that pinnacle, is because they skipped to the climax and then brought us back to the beginning. I think it's because it takes the entire show, which is this average, ordinary person way over their head because actually deep down inside they're not a great person, and they are willing to use that to get what they want, is like pushed to that extreme. All of that is present.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why it's a great cold open, not just because they skipped forward into a more climactic moment. If they'd done something like that, if they'd just taken those same kind of elements and put it into a different like scene, they just redone it, I think we would have had a great cold open. I don't think it would have been the same great cold open, but I think we could have had a great cold open. But basically, I think that the essential nature of trying to set up your story is being able to, in a very short period of time, establish what your story is, where it's going, and why. Like, there's the concept of a slug line, which is like 2-3 sentences, explain your story. There was a TV show on Netflix I've been watching a little bit of called Love, Death, and Robots. And I read one of the episode descriptions. I was like, that's great. What a great little episode description. One of it was like mercenaries and an archaeologist fight against vampires with cats. And I'm like, all right, cool. I'm down. I don't know what this is. I don't care. Let's go watch it. Another one was like two supernatural soldiers, or was it like deep in Afghanistan, two supernatural soldiers must fight against their own kind. And you're like, okay, cool. I know exactly what to expect from this. We're in Afghanistan, so like the U.S., Afghanis, like we have some terrorist elements thrown in. We have like who knows what's going on, and we have supernatural. I don't need to know anything more than that. I have the general picture of the story in my head. Everything else is just the details that people will sprinkle onto it. That's kind of what you're doing in an opening scene, is you're giving those kinds of moments without explaining them. You're letting the audience kind of encounter these things that tell them what the show is going to be without being like, hey guys, the show is going to be this one thing. And by the way, if you can't hear that on the mic, I'm super sorry. I'm whispering for dramatic effect, and it's hilarious for everyone who can see me doing it. I'm also looking at the computer monitor while I'm apologizing because that's where I'm picturing the audience. So I apologize for that as well. But yeah, what do you think? You are much more film-oriented than I am. I am much more TV. What, in your opinion, is kind of a great opening scene?
I guess that goes into the... I came up with 3 requirements for an opening film scene. Now, of course, you made it much more clear to me that opening scenes, and I for the life of me, I can't remember any specifically, but where it is in one scene or one moment, you are boiling down the rest of the film in that. I think my ideas of what a good opening scene is relate to tone, setting, and energy. But you also get an introduction to at least one character. And maybe that scene with that one character not only informs you about them, but informs you about, how they'll behave the rest of the film and how they might make decisions.
Right.
But not necessarily this is a microcosm of the entire plot in one moment.
Right.
Let's see. I think I labeled them. An opening scene can be an action scene, in which case you are giving people an adrenaline rush. And usually an adrenaline rush action scene for your opening either imparts a bit of information that is useful to the audience for later, because it's something that the main character doesn't know about. Right. Or you're
so kind of like the opening to Lord of the Rings. At least not for the action section, because the opening for Lord of the Rings isn't meant to. Well, the music is kind of meant to drive up your emotions and get that adrenaline kind of going, but it's there to tell you stuff about the ring that the main characters don't yet know.
Yes, and I will tie back to that because I had other points about Lord of the Rings. Or you are establishing a character's personality, which I think definitely the opening to Casino Royale does that. It introduces you to James Bond and how he will handle a situation. And I think the other Daniel Craig films do the exact same thing, but I think at least the second film, Quantum of Solace, imparts a bit of information before the title starts. I forget what Skyfall does in the opening. Oh, he's being chased on the train and he gets shot and falls off. So that's establishing that someone they wanted to kill him and get him out of commission, but it turns out he's all right afterwards. And I don't think the Sean Connery films opened with a scene. I think they just went right into the titles and then began the film. Because that's how you had to do things back then. You always had to start with titles up until the 70s when Star Wars came out, and then George Lucas went against tradition and started with just the title card and moved on.
For someone who's not reviled is the wrong word, but someone who is not necessarily like appreciated as a great director, we talk about George Lucas a lot.
Yes, we do.
Like, it's surprising how often we're like, oh yeah, and George Lucas did this one thing, and oh yeah, and then George Lucas came by and was like, let's try it all differently, and we're like, cool, let's do that. And then we come back to the prequels and we're like, George Lucas, go burn in hell forever.
Except he still had many good ideas for the TV series. He went further than his films and made the TV series rather good, but he also got Dave Filoni on board. Right. And Dave says he learned everything from George.
And I'm really excited to see The Mandalorian, which also has Dave Filoni.
I am so glad they gave him a shot on live action.
I really am interested to see, first of all, what's his name? Prince Oberyn from Game of Thrones. His real name is something very interesting that I just can't remember because I just don't care. Love him to death. I actually really enjoy him as an actor, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what he can do because, like, some of the things he's done since he died in Game of Thrones haven't been really, like, in my opinion, like the best offering from his skills. And so I've been sort of like, oh yeah, I would really like to see what you could do with given that space. And so I'm hoping The Mandalorian will kind of give him that. But
so he's going to be the Mandalorian?
I believe so. As far as I'm aware, which isn't super far, I believe he is. That actually leads me to an interesting thought I just had about other ways to kind of tease information to your audience or set up expectations or tone. Like, I just watched a TV show on Netflix called Kingdom, which is a Korean drama, so automatically hate me for that. But it was called Kingdom. It's a 6-episode series, and it's about zombies in feudal Korea. And the credit sequence, which they do have, is nothing but this death ritual where they're like performing acupuncture on this individual, and like you have all these incenses and all these different things. And it seems like just a very standard kind of like funerary practice, except there are weird elements to it that seem off, and you're not entirely sure why or what's going on because, you know, just from my cultural context, I'm not completely and totally intimately familiar with Korean funerary rites. But there are a few different things that you're like, I'm pretty sure you don't do that. That's pretty weird. Come to find out, and granted, I'm not trying to spoil this for any of the people on this monitor that I'm now looking at about the show, but you come to find out that that was basically the process by which they brought the king of the country back as a zombie so they could pretend he was alive long enough for them to produce a male heir to oust the crown prince. And it's a very weird political thing, but you find out every time you watch that opening that is this whole setup. Like, basically, that is the before the first scene of the movie rolls, that's already happened. And they're taking those credits and doing kind of an artistic tonal showpiece on what kind of like that fictional existence storyline, like before the movie actually starts, kind of thing. And it was really fascinating to me, just because most people take that credit sequence and decide to do something like fun with it, or like overly artsy, like Luke Cage comes to mind, or Daredevil, where they're cool openings, but they really add nothing to the show. They're not like there to tell you anything or show you anything. They're just there to like do something cool and dramatic. So it was really interesting to see something else use that space in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm a sucker for cool and dramatic visual openings.
Mm-hmm.
To dial back to what I was saying about what I think needs to be in an opening, having an adrenaline rush with an action scene and a bit of information was one. Introducing a character really well is the second, but that also ties into the action scene, but it also doesn't have to, because it doesn't have to be an action scene to introduce a character before the titles. That, I guess that happens kind of in Kiki's Delivery Service. They try to introduce her character, but I think you really don't get a sense of her until after that little 50s, was it like doo-wop song plays?
Well, some of the best, at least in my opinion, some of the best instances in the form of introducing individual characters come from like longer running franchises, like Murder on the Orient Express does a great job in their opening scenes of setting up Poirot. I can't say his name.
I've stumbled over that many times.
That gentleman. They do a great job of doing nothing but establishing him. Yes. The same is true of basically like every Sherlock Holmes movie I've ever seen.
Right.
Because basically that character is your hook. It's what you hang the rest of your story on. And so they do usually a great job of just establishing that character.
Because you almost always, not in The Hound of the Baskervilles, but you almost always have him solving one case, like wrapping it up, and then you move on to the new case for this film.
Right.
The third kind of opening was just setting up tone. That's it. And the two films that come to mind, which I tone and setting have to go hand in hand. The two films that come to mind really well are The Land Before Time,
which is a classic. Love Land Before Time.
And Bicentennial Man,
which I am not familiar with.
Bicentennial Man, I don't know how well it's liked by people. I think it sits in the middle, but it's a film that really works for me because, I mean, when I watched Brave Little Toaster the last time, that was many years ago now, but I watched it in sophomore year of college because I hadn't 6 years up to that point. When I did, I was distraught for 3 days because this film just affected me so much. And it always ties back to very innocent, very incapable characters. Like they're walking, talking appliances. They
Right.
They
The ability of the brave little toaster to fight off anything is kind of absurd in just the idea.
It's absurd, but I also feel such pity for them because it's scary to think that they could get crushed or broken, rusted, thrown off cliffs. Like
Right.
I really get attached to them, and to see them nearly die at the end there, and then they're all right. Like that really takes it out of me. Bicentennial Man has a similar feeling because it's about a mass-produced robot who is like a home assistant or like a butler that you purchase and becomes a part of your family. But by the time that his first owner passes away, he is given his freedom to not be attached to anyone. He can now live amongst everyone else on his own, trying to find work, trying to make a life. And he eventually finds
a German toy maker who names him his son, and then we have Pinocchio, the spin-off version.
Well, he does meet something of a toy maker. He's a mechanic and a robots expert, but he deals in synthetic skin and synthetic organs. And so Robin Williams plays the main robot character. He decides he wants to be given a real face and real working organs and like simulated organs. And so I guess it's something like 30 years or so after he was first made, he becomes almost human-like.
Right.
And he falls in love with the granddaughter of his first owner. And they hook up.
Which has got to be weird for everybody. I mean, if you think about hooking up with Robin Williams, period, that's already weird. If you think about hooking up with Robin Williams as a robot, that's weird. If you think about hooking up with Robin Williams, who was probably your caretaker when you visited your grandfather, that's just disturbing.
That hadn't happened. That hadn't happened yet. He left when his owner's daughter was still a little kid. And so he hadn't met up with the family in many years.
So it's not super creepy.
Not as much.
Gotcha.
I think there was a period of like 15, 20 years where he wasn't in much contact with them. But his owner dies. His owner's daughter dies. He's there for her on her deathbed. And then at the very end of the film, like near the end of the film, Robin's character is appealing to a government body for citizenship to gain a legal sense of humanity.
Yeah.
Like you are classified as a human being because you have met all these criteria. And on his deathbed, he is granted full humanity by the legal system. And he's even in his deathbed with his wife, who is the granddaughter of his former owner. And so every time I get to that final scene, it really gets to me because this is a character who was crafted by man and lives 200 years and dies as a human. Like that journey is miraculous to me. And so to reach back to openings, you cannot show this man's death until you show his birth. So we see in the opening credits the manufacture process of every part of this robot character.
Right.
Put to some of the most whimsical and heart-tugging music I've heard from composer James Horner, who of course also did The Land Before Time. So you have two miraculous themes, but The Land Before Time is more thunderous and epic rather than like twinkly and tiny, and the Bicentennial Man has this tempo.
Land Before Time is really the story about it's a story that like history has forgotten. The whole point of it is kind of it's a small little story in a much wider world that never will really ever appreciate it.
Right.
Which is kind of what you're talking about with those smaller sounds, those kind of like I'm not a musician. But like the bells and the sounds of like wind chimes and things like that. I'm picturing it in my head, but I can't really describe it well.
the Land Before Time theme, or the opening theme, starts out with low, I want to say French horns, starting out with murky water and showing tiny little creatures, and it slowly pans over and fades into bigger and bigger creatures until you see the brachiosauruses, and that's when the French horns really blast out.
Right.
In Bicentennial Man, you have pistons and gears mixed in with a clanky tempo to mimic the factory sounds.
Right, sort of like a working song.
Right. With piano. And piano always gets to me when you have it's a melody that evokes the emotion of the main character and his need to be more than he was.
Right.
Like that's what I get from themes like that, from melodies like that. It always helps to evoke a character's inner struggle.
Right.
Opening titles and themes, there were a few others that I had where you don't have an opening scene, but you just start with the title. And I realized that there were two films that I could compare directly together because they almost do the same thing. And that is the original Star Wars and Krull.
The Krull classic. Why wouldn't we? Did you go watch that in theaters when they did the Fathom release for the Mystery Science Theater?
No, I actually didn't. I've never managed to make it through the whole film, but I should. I forgot they did that. I need to see if they released it.
You should go watch it. It's I did not watch it in theaters. From the parts of it that I have seen since, it's great. Krull is not great, but the Mystery Science Theater of Krull is great.
Yeah. So what you have there with the original Star Wars, I just saw a video from a YouTube channel called Hack Fraud Media, and it was basically the son of Plinkett. He tried to mimic the same voice, and he tried to do his
Mr. Plinkett.
Right.
Yeah.
He did his own review of The Force Awakens because he felt Plinkett didn't do a great job with that, not like his older reviews. And I feel like that's kind of true because he harped on so many other things and then finally talked about the new movie rather than nitpicking about everything like he did before. So this guy did a wonderful job, and his voice of Plinkett actually gets better once he does The Last Jedi. But in The Force Awakens, he points out that right from the get-go, The Force Awakens loses a bit of charm because it just starts with that ominous Lucasfilm logo and no 20th Century Fox logo. Now, obviously, you wouldn't have the 20th Century Fox logo, but he points out that when John Williams was writing the score for the original Star Wars, he was the one who brought back the 20th Century Fox theme because they hadn't been using it for like 40 years. So he brought it back from 1933, recomposed it, and once that plays, you have the blue text where everything cuts to black, silence, and then the Star Wars logo blasts from your face into the distance, and the fanfare for the logo and the Star Wars theme are in the same key.
Right.
So you have that, you have the horns, silence, anticipation, blam. Here's the horns again, same key. So you are instilling a sense of excitement and anticipation in your audience before you get the film going. The new movie loses that because it just starts on black. And he was saying, well, why not have something like the Disney logo up there, but designed for the Star Wars brand and have a new theme that's not the Disney theme that they're using now, but something that evokes what used to be there. Because even on the soundtrack, and even when they play it in concert, they play the 20th Century Fox theme before the Star Wars theme almost every time. It's just part of the music now.
Right.
But once you get past that, then you get to the title crawl, and normally, and because it was done so many times afterward, you'd think it would be narrated. You would have a narrator telling you all this exposition, but he decided, I'll do a title crawl and I'll have people read this before we move on. But once that goes away, then it pans down and we immediately dive into an action moment with that giant Star Destroyer coming over, and you instill in the audience a sense of awe. You establish the major powers at play, and you prove to everyone that you've got something special to offer them with the visual effects that will be peppered throughout this experience. Right. You are taking this extremely seriously. This is not your mom and dad's Flash Gordon. This is the next level.
Right.
So then, of course, you have all of your copycats, all of your Star Wars impersonators and fantasy films that want to take little bits and pieces of that. So I think Kroll was, I want to say 84 or 85. Most of those fantasy films are between 83 and 86, with some of them even earlier, because Excalibur was 1980. Legend was 85. Neverending Story was 84. So when that film starts, it's a little bit like Labyrinth, because Labyrinth is iffy. I'm a little iffy on how that starts, because that's mostly just a...
This is Labyrinth by Del Toro? Or is this
no,
a separate
this
Labyrinth?
is the Jim Henson Labyrinth.
Oh, okay, gotcha, yeah.
You start that movie off with a CGI owl that flutters past the screen, and I think there's a mirror effect where it flies into itself and it kind of fractures. But you have the David Bowie song playing over that, and that's okay. But it's not as great of an opening as it could be. But I think it's one of those openings where we just want to set you up with a good piece of music. We just want to show you the titles. We don't want to show you anything exciting until later.
Right.
And sometimes that's all right. And I think for me, that's one of the films where, okay, we'll just go basic for this. But Kroll is a film that it's odd, because you have another piece of music by James Horner. And this is one of those films where he started with Battle Beyond the Stars. He did the theme music for that. And that was partially, from what I can tell, it was partially inspired by the music of Jerry Goldsmith for the Star Trek motion picture. And of course, James then did Star Trek II. And the way that he composed Star Trek II is almost the exact same motifs and riffs and style of using his horn section that he used for 4 other films after that.
And we don't judge him for how he used his horn section. That is every person's individual choice, and we allow them to do that. We don't judge. We are very open-minded.
So Kroll has a very similar approach to the music, except it has that sort of regal trumpeting riff that he throws in there, like the harmony that royal trumpet sections have been used in like films from the 50s. So you build up his music, and it starts with a chorus of women wailing, kind of, I guess it's meant to evoke outer space, because we do start in outer space. This is one of those fantasy films that acknowledges, oh, there's other planets, and we're part of a galaxy of different planets and different alien races. But we start out like that, and there's this the glaive, the 4-sided throwing star that's in the film, that flutters by, goes left, goes up, goes into the background, and then it flies up and reveals the title. And that's all you get for the first 45 seconds, building up this theme that's slowly rising in volume and tempo until you get to the whole orchestra playing off. But once that happens, then we slowly fade in to, I think it's 3 shots for the next 3 minutes of a giant rock floating through space.
Compelling stuff. Really, really attention-grabbing stuff.
And my big problem with how they handled it was you have this incredible theme, this wondrous, beautiful theme that should be accompanied by much better visuals than this, because you're for 3 minutes you're just watching a giant mountain of rock, a floating alien fortress floating through space at 5 miles an hour.
Right.
In 3 shots. You know, it's not even from an epic shot. You're looking at it coming forward towards you, then at a 45-degree angle to a vanishing point off center, and then you're watching, you're slowly rotating around it, I think.
Uh-huh.
But that ain't no Star Destroyer shot.
Right. Right.
There's no real establishment of scale. There's no establishment of what this gigantic thing is meant to be until it lands on Earth and you realize, oh, this is some sort of strange mythical alien mountain fortress that lands on not Earth. Like, it's such a
classic
weird...
not Earth. I love not Earth. It's my favorite place to go visit on a vacation. I love not Niagara Falls. It's maybe my favorite part. You get there and you're like, ooh, it's falling up. It's the best.
That opening doesn't quite understand what it's doing with itself. It's trying to imitate Star Wars in little bits, but it's not really establishing anything for the rest of the film. It's not establishing any theme. It's not establishing any relationships. It's not establishing setting, because we don't even see where we are until after this giant mountain lands.
Right.
And the theme is so magical and wondrous and well composed, you'd wish that they would put better visuals underneath it that would be more exciting, like maybe panning across a tapestry of something, or slowly panning through a detailed model of sculpture, like showing different vignettes of scenes all sculpted out of marble, and some of them are cracked and broken. Something creative like that. Or maybe like the opening of The Last Starfighter, we're floating past planets and into a warp tunnel, and here's the credits, you know, and
Last Starfighter, also a great movie. Keep going.
More fitting to what is established by the narration that follows this opening of Krull, you show the villain's fortress taking over planets one by one, and it wouldn't quite match with the uplifting theme. The theme really should be put against the heroes doing something, but you could open the film with the villain conquering worlds and showing that through animated visuals and artwork, if not actual visual effects of models and pyrotechnics.
Yeah. Real quick, just as a general question, how does the exposition crawl work for you before that? In the original Star Wars, you have in episode 4, you have the exposition crawl where they're like a small band of rebels doing this thing, and then it pans down to the planet, or does it pan up?
It pans down.
It pans down, and that was why people were mad at Rogue One, because it didn't pan, and people were like, "Oh no, Rogue One sucks. It's not part of the continuity because it didn't pan down." It was weird.
I think we start with us floating over rings of a planet and seeing a ship pass over them, and then it goes down to the planet. That's Krennic's ship.
And Rogue One. Yeah. But that's kind of my question, is you're talking about the opening of episode 4 kind of after the exposition part starts. Like, most of the things you've talked about, like the score coming in and like the first visuals and things like that, are kind of right after that. So do you include that in the opening in your mind? Because that would be almost...
I do. Because I'm thinking about it with these two examples. I'm thinking about it in terms of what happens before the first line of dialogue is spoken.
Right.
And like because other instances you will have scenes of just action and dialogue. It'll just be happening. So some scenes will do that. They'll just jump right into a scene. Other stuff, you'll get a title sequence that's self-contained. You have all the credits, you have the title, you have the theme, and you have some visuals maybe. It's boxed off. But Star Wars, it's continuous because the star field is always there.
Right.
So the titles come in, the crawl comes in, it fades off, you pan down, and we're still going.
Right.
So I do kind of tie that in that instance because it's all self-contained before we cut inside the Tantive 4 and C-3PO starts talking.
See, I would, granted, coming from a much stronger stance on like the importance of structure and like theme and those sorts of things over like tone and music and sort of those sorts of ideas, that opening title crawl to me almost undermines part of that opening, because essentially in that title crawl you have the idea of a little force fighting at the big empire, and they're not doing great, but they're going to try and they're going to hopefully find something to fight them with. And then you go to an immediate representation of that in symbol of the small ship running away from the big ship.
Yes. It's
so
probably
to some
not,
degree, like, to me, it sort of feels like one undercuts the other. Either the title crawl is sufficient to set up that theme, or the visual image is, but putting one just before the other kind of weakens both.
it might waste a little time. I don't think it weakens anything, but it's probably unnecessary for the first film. I think by the second film, does it feel more necessary because time has passed?
For the title crawl?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like the title crawl probably makes the most sense in the first one because it's establishing the rest of the world. You know, that's the part that lets our dear friend George Lucas, who we've talked about several times, kind of skip over some things that normally you'd have to confront. Because basically he goes through and is like, here are the players, here's what's going on, now let's get straight to people shooting each other with big ships.
So now you're saying it does serve a purpose.
Oh, no, it does serve a purpose. My point is that the purpose is to establish the universe.
Right.
Which is the same purpose that the ships are serving.
Yes.
The only difference is that the title sequence is the only part of it that I say is like completely, that's non-derivative, that's not like just reiterating what's about to happen, is the place names.
That's
like,
probably true
we
because
hear,
Darth Vader tells you about the plans that were stolen,
right,
in almost the same way,
right,
and he confronts Princess Leia about it. He talks to his own guys and her about it, so we're made very clear that plans have been stolen. They're sequestered somewhere. We see Leia put those into R2, and we learn that that's what they were later.
Right.
So yeah, the title crawl probably is very redundant.
Right, and that's the part where, like, looking at it from an editorial standpoint, it's kind of like, okay, cool. What is completely essential about this part of it that keeps me from just cutting it out for the sake of cutting it out? And the part of it that is the fact that, one, you're setting up the fact that the rebels have won. You know, like there's that opening, like the rebels having just won one time, did this thing. We're like, okay, cool. They're not just like there's a chance they're fighting. There's an actual conflict. It's not just one little group being like, yeah, we're gonna fight you, we're so mad. You know, it's actually a group fighting. That's necessary because it helps set up the themes and the point. Like, instead of the, you know, Darth Vader having to be like,
ah, you all won the one time. Oh, curses. Now we have to go and find the thing you stole.
Right.
Or you're like, oh yeah, when he's like, find the thing they stole. We're like, cool, yes, we're on board. They stole the thing. We all know this.
Well, we get a little bit of that in the Death Star meeting room.
Right.
Which I think is a half hour into the film or more.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's also folded into some characterization, if I remember it correctly.
Yeah.
Which I probably don't. But that actually comes back to a different point. You established three kinds of openings. Basically, you had the opening establishing tone, you had the opening establishing character, and you had opening...
just building up adrenaline.
Just building up adrenaline.
Mostly.
I would alter that to a fourth category that is opening establishing plot. Let's see if I can think of a good example for this. Hunt for Red October, maybe? There are a couple movies that are like plot-heavy, plot-centric. Actually, no, Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a wonderful example of this. The opening of Lord of the Rings has nothing to do with any of the main characters.
No.
period. It has nothing to do with the tone of the movie. A little bit. Like, it kind of does, but most of the movie isn't Galadriel talking to us in a deep, imposing voice, which was great and lovely, and I appreciated.
I think you're mostly getting setting, you're getting scope there, but you aren't necessarily getting tone.
But you're getting the plot. Because the whole point is we have a MacGuffin that we must take to a place and destroy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they do for the next 3 movies.
Right. And that's your yes, you're right, because I said action sequence that imparts some information, but those should probably be separate. Because I think opening a film with an action scene that does nothing more than have action is wasteful. It needs to have a character introduction, or it needs to impart a bit of information. If it doesn't, it's just kind of there. So you're right. There should be a 4th category where it's mostly establishing plot.
And I will point out they do definitely have a lot of action in that opening.
They do.
You know, because we see the orcs and the elves all killing each other, and it's glorious and great. But that's really not like the feeling of the first movie. The first movie isn't really about the great epic battles yet. We're not quite to that. That's, you know, to Two Towers and Return of the King. But yeah, and I think that's really kind of a good opening is defined by what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to get an audience to connect with the story you're telling them. You're trying to take them somewhere. And basically, the machine that you're using to take them places are usually one of those 4 things.
Yes. Right. And I was even thinking it needs to be any 2 together, because if it's not doing any 2, then it's less than it could be. The 3rd was tone and setting, because I think tone and setting go hand in hand. You can't necessarily establish tone unless you establish setting, except Bicentennial Man was more tone and a bit of backstory.
So we have tone, we have plot, we have character, and then we have
plot, character, and just imparting a tiny bit of information through an action scene. Just a little nugget of information useful for later. It's not necessarily
more like a phantom setup, like where you're like setting up a thing.
Right. It's more or less what you're talking about in TV shows, where you have that opening 2 or 3 minutes where you're just hooking the audience for the rest of the film, and then the titles start.
Right. I would maybe, and this I guess would be more true for like drama, but there's also theme. Like this was my general point, my overarching point. Whether or not you have a good opening is whether or not you are clearly setting the expectations of the audience and engaging their interest in that setup. You know, like North and South, the TV show on, I believe you can also watch it on Netflix, because Netflix is great until they start making us pay more money, and then we're all going to hate them. But it's an English drama. It's about class, and it's about girl who likes guy who is, you know, surly, or surly guy who likes girl who is too stuck up to like him. It's that kind of a thing. It is really about the themes of the story. You know, North and South is about the cultural differences between where these 2 characters come from. And that's the theme of the piece. I feel like if you have, and this maybe is going back to what you're saying, I think that a good opening will have as many of these categories as it can manage. You know,
yes, it really should.
Having a drama with an action opening, probably not relevant. North and South doesn't need to have an action set piece as it's setting up its plot. But having character moments in the midst of your tone and your theme setup, those things are almost integral to each other. Like, you can do them without each other to some degree, but it's very hard to have a meaningful character moment that doesn't relate to your theme.
Right.
Because if it doesn't, this was an interesting point. I watched a video the other day discussing recurring motifs in Hamilton, the musical. Because basically, there are certain lines that are repeated throughout different songs that take on different meanings based on which song they're now spoken in. one of the best lines is satisfied, like the word satisfied. There's an entire song dedicated to that motif, involving one sister and various things like that. It's then brought up later as kind of a burn against another character by saying, I knew you'd never be satisfied, which is referring back to this other emotional conflict and this other theme that they've been doing that, and it's now a new expression of that same theme. If you don't have a character moment that somehow we can recontextualize later based on that theme changing, it's not going to be a character moment that people will really remember because there's nothing to remind them of it. The prequels, sadly enough, are wonderful examples of this because they have 3 movies through which you see some themes actually kind of go around. One of the worst and best things I've seen lately on the internet are people who go through the prequel movies and do like edited cuts of things, like Obi-Wan and Anakin being buddies and having fun. And you go through and, you know, they'll put music over it and you're like, oh, this is kind of fun. But you realize that the moments that they share at the end of those 3 movies are completely and totally different in your mind when you go back and think about where they started. Like, somebody took the opening cut of Obi-Wan meeting Anakin, where he's a little kid and Obi-Wan's a bigger human, and then put it next to Obi-Wan staring down at Anakin when Anakin was burning on the River of Lava. And you realize think about the character feeling of that. You know, Obi-Wan, this person who's like, I met you, I knew you, I've kind of de facto raised you your whole life, and now I'm leaving you here to die because of who you've become. If you think about that, there are a lot of interesting kind of character colors that you can add to those actions. It's not inherent to the piece. It's not something that you look at and you're like, Obi-Wan's clearly torn up about this in the same way I think he is. But when you look at the different moments throughout the film and string them together, you kind of can't help but be brought to certain conclusions like that, into ideas where it's like, oh, these are consistent characters doing consistent sorts of things, which leads them here. This is now really, really sad, which is why a lot of people will defend the prequels and say the prequels are actually not as bad as people say, because when looked at all together, a lot of the bad parts of the first one are forgivable when you know where they're going.
Right. And most people will say that Revenge of the Sith is one that they liked.
Mm-hmm.
So it leads into something that was okay.
Right. Revenge of the Sith was one of my favorite Star Wars movies for a while. I once defended it on an online forum to a bunch of nerds, and that did not go well for me. But I did it, and I was very proud of myself. But yeah, it's kind of like that with any good moment. Any good moment should be able to have callbacks to it. Game of Thrones is right now in its last season. The second episode came out last Sunday, to date this podcast a little bit, considering it probably won't come out for weeks and weeks and weeks, and this will all be old news. But there was a line where somebody referred to Jaime Lannister saying, the things I do for love, when he shoved Bran out the window in episode 1. And the person saying it was Bran. And so the irony of the guy who was almost murdered as a child repeating the justification of the person who almost murdered him is so ironic and so interesting. It is such an interesting thematic turn. I feel like if you can't work in something in your opening that can become that, and that's why you see so many openings that kind of bookend. You'll see an opening that sort of like sets up something that then you'll see somebody pay off at the end. Like, I want to say Red October does that. Like, I want to say Red October is kind of does an opening where it's a bunch of cuts of, like, the main character, like, reading blueprints as with coffee and, like, walking around his house and doing stuff. And then the ending is him, like, putting them all away and, like, being with his daughter or something like that. They do that to help remind you of where you started. And so next time you start, you already know where it's going and you can appreciate the journey in a different way.
Yes.
So...
No, those are lovely points. I really liked that.
Openings are such an interesting kind of idea to deal with because they're really kind of, no matter where your film goes, it is your introduction. You know, like it's sort of like when you meet somebody for the first time. Your first impressions of them will either be overcome by who, like your growing knowledge of them, or they'll be confirmed. But either way, your first impression will never really change. And that's kind of, I guess, why those opening moments are so important.
Absolutely.
Because if you can't tie down that, like, if you can't make a good first impression, you better make sure that you're making the wrong impression for the right reasons.
Yes. I remembered another opening that I really like.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall Great Muppet Caper?
I do. I can't remember its opening terribly well, but I do remember the film.
What it does in the opening is, I think we initially start off with Kermit, Fozzie, and Gonzo as their characters in this film's context, because they're playing characters not themselves.
Right.
They're journalists. So it starts off with them in a hot air balloon, and they just play this slow melodic string music that evokes later themes in the soundtrack. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing this hot air balloon float by in different spots on the screen with the titles fading in slowly and them, once in a while chiming in with dialogue. But it's a very calming opening that then leads into a bombastic opening number where they sing about being in a movie. Here's all the plot points. Here's who we are.
Right.
We're going to get this started. Anybody else want to join in? Here's all the cameos.
Right.
Here's some of the cameos. Here's some of the supporting cast. It's a very meta opening theme.
And they even have the
opening
throwaway
song.
line. Like the whole film is very meta, but they have the throwaway line where the villain is like, why am I doing this? Because I'm a villain. It's plain and simple. And I'm like, yes, thank you, sir. Good job.
Right.
I'm proud of you. Yeah.
And I adore that movie because it surprisingly does a beautiful job of evoking I want to say a 40s film. It evokes the tone. It does the song, the musical numbers extremely well.
Right.
It takes itself very seriously, except when it wants to make a joke. It kind of it bounces back and forth so well because the main characters are all puppets.
That's a different episode we should do. We need to do an episode on Taika Waititi and his treatment of humor and drama and kind of how he combines and pairs the two, because that's a very interesting theme to me, and I love a lot of his work. And my brother doesn't, but who cares about my brother? I mean, my mom does, but that's, it's about what that is.
You like ribbing on your brother?
I do, but mainly because I love him dearly, and he just has a hard time. He just has a hard time. That's about that, yeah.
I guess with the Great Muppet Caper, it's a 2-part opening because you have the opening credits and then the musical number doesn't have any credits.
Right.
And it blatantly, through exposition in the entire song, explains the film for you. Before that, you're setting... I think it does exactly what I just said. You're writing that line of the serious and the comedic. So that's what the opening does. It starts out serious and calming with these titles slowly fading in and out, just kind of waving in the breeze, go with the flow. And then it dives into the comedy and the self-referential stuff. And once that ends, then the movie gets going because we snap into a photograph in a newspaper that their version of Perry White is reading.
Right. I love the Muppets in general. They're great. Did you want to talk about, now that we are kind of discussing Muppets and various other things, that we've already kind of touched on character a little bit, but did you want to talk about character and characterization and kind of the connections there?
Yes, I think that's where I was having trouble. I guess not just with openings that are sans title and sans theme, like opening theme music, but openings that are are just a scene or a sequence
Mm-hmm.
establishing character. Yes.
Well, and this is something that I just realized I'd forgotten. Something I was told once is that essentially the opening is supposed to set up your core fantasy. If you're going to go watch an action movie, you know what that means. Like, you know what like mental fantasy you're playing out.
Right.
You know, regardless of whether or not you're actually fantasizing about being the characters or anything else, you know what's being sold to you. You know what the packaging is. That's kind of the same sort of thing with character openings, because essentially characters have core concepts or core fantasies to them, inherent to themselves. You know, let's see. Let me think of a decent character. Um, yeah, Tyrion Lannister, who is a great character, whom I love dearly. His setup is basically you. I think the first time you ever run into him, he's in a brothel, and he's having a deep philosophical conversation with one of the workers there about wage labor and whether or not women are paid as much as they should in the market. And it's a very interesting dissertation, and it's very compelling. They bring up some great points, and I really wish that HBO would really get more into those kinds of political conversations and spaces like they do in that opening. But I bring it up because in that scene, you establish basically all that you need to know about him. Like, his brother has to come in and drag him out and be like, hey, you've got to get back to work. You can tell that he doesn't entirely care about a lot of these things. He's really in it for himself. He's fun and he's funny. He's a dwarf. You get all of those parts because the core fantasy of that character is the outcast. He's the funny reject. He's the guy that we all know and love to laugh with or at, but not the person we ever really spend time with. He's that guy. That's the core of his character. People that can relate to that really love him. People that just think he's funny really love him. He's very lovable, but he's not really accepted by many of the characters in the show. And we understand that from that opening. And I think that's true for most of the characters. Like, you know, Ned Stark, when he get his opening, he's the one passing judgment and killing the deserter from the Night's Watch. And he's not doing it because he like just has this hard on for murdering people. He's doing it because it's his duty, because he's supposed to, and because he should, not even necessarily because he feels like he should, but because it's his duty to do it. And that establishes the whole point of his character. What is it? There's a famous concept called save the cat, when they talk about introducing characters or introducing at least your lead character, in that you need to make them do something likable. You have to make them do something that makes people go, ooh, I like him. He's fun. He's interesting. I appreciate this. And people have spilt a lot of ink over this, and or blood, depending on how you feel about it. Because defining what that means has kind of always been a struggle. Walter White does not save anyone in the opening of Breaking Bad. Because every time he does anything, like even when he defends Walter White Jr. from the people that are picking on him, what he's really doing is asserting the dominance that he like has felt deprived of his whole life. He's really just acting out, and he's really doing it for himself. He's not really doing it for anybody else. What makes that interesting is we like seeing it. It's not necessarily a fun thing to watch. It's not necessarily, well, okay, no, it's a lot of fun to watch. It's not necessarily something that you're like, oh yeah, you saved this thing, or you like did something fun and interesting. You did something compelling. And that's the same sort of thing. If you have a character that can do something within the first few minutes of meeting him that we can look at and go, ooh, that was interesting, we will stay with that character until the next time it does something. I think what's more interesting almost is when we fall out of love with characters. Like, I think that the moment people like will stop paying attention to character is when they start acting in ways that are not consistent to that core fantasy of that character. Like, if Ned Stark had ever cracked a joke inappropriately, we all would have, like, just been like, nope, we're out, done, not funny, I'm out. And the one exception to that, and this is maybe more towards character progression and character arcs, is when something awful happens and the character has to change. Like, you know, I'm using Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones is a wonderful example of this. But have you've seen Game of Thrones?
I tried watching the original first two episodes. I gave up after that.
Yeah, no, that's entirely fair. If you can't get into it, it's not something I recommend to people generally. It's not like, oh yeah, like go watch this thing. But I'm also assuming then you don't care if I spoil some things.
No.
There's a character who is widely known as one of the best swordsmen in the land. Goes off and is just kind of like this rambunctious, sort of like a frat boy with a sword, kind of like, oh yeah, like I am the best, and that's just the way this is going to go. He stops being that very abruptly. But the reason he stops is because someone cuts off his hand. We have a character moment where he runs into something that is so completely paradigm shifting that his character has to change. Otherwise, we wouldn't believe it. If his character remained the same after going through something like that, we'd be like, no, we're not into this. It's not interesting. If he'd picked up a sword with his one hand and had killed a bunch of people and been like, haha, with one hand I can still fight, like Zorro, we all would have been like, no, this isn't, that no one would do that. That's not realistic. Karen Travis, a wonderful writer, once said she never bases characters on real people because she believes real people are boring. I believe Karen Travis has never read history and doesn't know people. History is the story of ordinary people taken into extreme settings. That's what storytelling is. We just do it fictionally as opposed to like studying other people who've done it. When you take a character into an extreme situation that forces them to change, that's when it's all right for a character's core fantasy to change. Because Jaime's core fantasy was basically the rich kid. He was the rich, good-looking guy who kind of got all the girls, and it was great. That was basically his whole character fantasy. That changes as soon as he loses his hand, because then it becomes about redemption. It goes from, how do you take this person who is basically completely awful and take them to this place where they're actually decent and a good person? What does it take to get there? How does that work out in that person's life? And that's the part of it that's really cool for him. You can't just do it. You can't just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to make this character go whoop, because then they stop being interesting to us. Because not only are they now a new character, they're a new character that never passed through a tribulation to make them a new character, and they might be destroying a character that we liked. They might not be. They might be destroying a character that we hated, which is why some people will come back to a show like in the next season, like Flash. I'm not sure if they've ever done this particular thing, but like if you come back after skipping 2 seasons and you're like, oh yeah, this character is wildly different, I like them now. You know, there you go. You can do that. That can happen. But people will never accept changes to a character that they like without justification.
You've been listening to Shootin the Shot, Part 1 of Opening Sequences, with my guest, Christopher Horton. In Part 2, we'll be shifting gears a little bit into character introductions. Being that this was our first episode, I wasn't sure exactly how the conversation would go, and so I had a couple of different topic areas I wanted to discuss with him, and one of them was opening sequences. The second was character introductions, and somehow, naturally, it all wove into one long conversation, so I decided to split it in half and rearrange some of the discussions that we had into a more effective order. So, if you've liked what you've heard so far, consider panning over to the next episode. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. I always enjoy getting to talk with Chris when I can, so I was glad I could share his insight with you. Have an excellent rest of your day, keep working on those story ideas, keep working on those films, and we will catch you next time.